In part one, we traced events in Dealey Plaza the fateful day of 22 November 1963 and the treatment that the president received at Parkland Hospital. After the body was forcibly removed from Parkland, it was taken to Air Force One and flown to Andrews Air Force Base, where in a ceremonial casket, where it would be transported in a Navy ambulance to Bethesda Naval Hospital for an autopsy that would be conducted by two naval officers, Commander James Humes, assisted by J. Thornton Boswell, and a lieutenant colonel from the Armed Forces Institute of Pathology, Lieutenant Colonel Pierre Fink. The wounds as they would be described at Bethesda as a result of the autopsy would be very different than those that were described at Parkland. You recall from the diagram that the wound at Parkland appeared to have the appearance of a heel, what I call the heel shot. But by the time the autopsy is complete, the description of that wound had grown considerably, and now it appeared to have the characteristics of a footprint. Let's take a look at this autopsy report, which you see was conducted by Humes, Boswell, and Fink. They arrived at the conclusion that the cause of death was a gunshot wound to the head. The autopsy report is interesting, especially for the first part called the clinical summary. The clinical summary begins by describing that President John F. Kennedy was riding in an open car in a motorcade during an official visit to Dallas, Texas on 22 November 1963. The president was sitting in the right rear seat with Mrs. Kennedy seated on the same seat to his left. Sitting directly in front of the president was Governor John B. Connally of Texas, and directly in front of Mrs. Kennedy sat Mrs. Connally. The vehicle was moving at a slow rate of speed down an incline into an underpass that leads to a freeway, headed to the Trade Mart where the president was to deliver an address. But notice now the second paragraph. 3 shots were heard and the president fell forward, bleeding from the head. Governor Connally was seriously wounded by the same gunfire. That's all very interesting because it creates the possibility that the governor might have literally been hit by the same gunfire. According to newspaper reports, the Washington Post, November 23, 1963, Bob Jackson, a Dallas Times-Herald photographer, said he looked around as he heard the shots and saw a rifle barrel disappearing into a window on an upper floor of the nearby Texas School Book Depository building. This paragraph is very odd for at least 3 reasons. First, it presents rumors and speculations as though they were the results of a serious investigation. But the assassination had occurred only the day before. The investigation had just begun. Some of these claims, such as the number of shots that were fired, have remained controversial to this day, and others, such as that the president fell forward, are known to be false. Second, even if the body might disclose how many times the president had been hit, it could not reveal how many shots had been fired, nor the number or locations of those who may have fired them. A properly conducted autopsy is intended to provide a scientific foundation for separating truth from fiction. But by including this paragraph as part of the report, that function was severely compromised. Third, the autopsy lasted from around 7 or 7:30 p.m. on the 22nd to the early hours of the 23rd, long before the Washington Post hit the street. You might have thought that the Post would want to publish the findings of these pathologists, but instead these pathologists published a story from the Post. It conjures up the image of Humes, Boswell, and Fink rushing to pick up a copy of a newspaper to discover what they should say in their autopsy report, which is absurd. The effect, however, was to incorporate what would become the official government theory of the assassination within the report itself, which could later be cited as providing proof for conjectures masquerading as facts. In logic, this practice is known as begging the question. In addition, in the next paragraph, there's a description of conversation with Malcolm Perry on November 23rd. According to pathologists, they only talked to Dr. Perry on the 23rd, and yet that's contrary to normal practice. Physicians insisted that they only learned of the wound to the throat after the autopsy itself was complete, when they called Dr. Perry the morning of the 23rd after the body had been taken away. This would turn out to be quite crucial to understanding the nature of the autopsy, because the physicians would claim that learning of the wound to the throat provided an explanation for something they otherwise had been unable to explain, namely where the wound to the back had exited. The description on the next page clearly describes a wound to the back. Situated on the upper right posterior thorax, just above the upper body of the scapula, there's a 7 by 4 millimeter oval wound. Notice I'm using that symbol to indicate each time we talk about the wound. And now they describe a wound to the throat in addition. Situated in the lower anterior neck, remember that's the throat, at approximately the level of the third or fourth tracheal rings, is a 6.5 centimeter long transverse wound with widely gaping irregular edges. Now, notice this description is very different than the wound as it was observed at Parkland. Remember Dr. Franshaw's diagram of a very small wound, and even after the tracheotomy, it was a very small wound with a straight incision. Here we find a large, gaping, irregular wound, very different. As you go down to the description, missile wounds, we're talking about a large, irregular defect of the scalp and skull on the right, involving chiefly the parietal bone, but extending somewhat into the temporal and occipital regions. Notice before, the wound was right in the back of the head, approximately the circumference of your fist when you double it up. Now it's grown, it's increased, and it has assumed the proportions of the footprint. In fact, that diagram of the footprint wound was reconstructed based upon the autopsy report by David Lifton, who provided the diagrams that I've been showing you of the 3 ways the wounds are described side by side. When you turn the page, you'd find that the description of the wounds, the wound to the head seems to tax the verbal abilities of the physicians, and they literally say, the complexity of these fractures and the fragments thus produce tax satisfactory verbal description and are better appreciated in photographs and rentgenogram x-rays which are prepared. So the physicians themselves here are referring those who would read the autopsy report to a series of photographs and x-rays that were taken during the autopsy. The rentgenograms. X-rays are subsequently described here as revealing minute metallic fragments in a line corresponding, and they describe a line, I'll show you later a diagram that indicates it, a line of fragments in the head that's very suggestive of a bullet wound to the head. They also describe 2 metallic fragments described as 7 by 2 millimeters and 3 by 1 millimeter that were turned over to 2 agents for the Federal Bureau of Investigation by the name of Francis O'Neill and James Seibert, who actually signed a receipt for those fragments. Then you find the description now in this paragraph number 2 of the wound to the back, which is said here to be a wound presumably of entry, that is supposed to have passed through the back of the president and through certain muscle tissues without hitting any bony tissue, and then to have exited through the throat. And notice the description here of the wound presumably of exit is supposed to be the same one described by Dr. Malcolm Perry of Dallas in the lower anterior cervical region, really meaning, of course, in the lower front part of the throat. This is the place, the location at which the physicians actually effect their inference, as they would explain it later before the Warren Commission and other bodies reviewing the autopsy, that they had made an inference, given that the body was gone and they had just now learned of the wound to the throat from Dr. Perry the following morning, that they concluded that it had to have been a single bullet that transited through the president's body from the back to the throat. On the bottom of the next page, it reports that the photographs, black and white and color photographs, were exposed but not developed and were turned over to Agent Roy Kellerman of the U.S. Secret Service, who executed a receipt therefor. At the top of the next page, we find that the x-rays, which were both exposed and developed, were also turned over to Secret Service Agent Roy Kellerman, who executed another receipt therefor. Finally, we arrive at a summary. The deceased died as a result of 2 perforating gunshot wounds inflicted by high-velocity projectiles fired by a person or person unknown. The projectiles were fired from a point behind and somewhat above the level of the deceased. The observations and available information do not permit a satisfactory estimate as to the sequence of these 2 wounds. A fatal missile entered the skull above and to the right of the external occipital protuberance. A portion of the projectile traversed the cranial cavity in a posterior anterior back to front direction, depositing minute particles along its path. So notice here we now have a description of two wounds, both of which are now supposed to have been fired from above and behind. Recall now the Parkland press conference, Dr. Perry described a wound to the throat that was fired from in front, and we had a large gaping wound to the back of the head that was evidently a wound of exit. At this point, however, the autopsy physicians have concluded quite to the contrary, that the wound to the throat was actually an exit wound for a bullet that entered the back of the president's right shoulder, and that the wound to the head was in fact one that entered in the back of the head and came forward. There's also a description of cerebrum, skull, and scalp that is related to the head wound, but there's no description here of extruding cerebellum. So the extruding cerebellum tissue that was witnessed by many physicians at Parkland is not described here as a part of this autopsy report. The description of the other wound now is contained in this paragraph. The other missile entered the right superior posterior thorax. That's about the level of your right shoulder, close to the neck, and traversed the tissues here, soft tissues passing through from back to front without hitting any hard bony tissue, and exiting through the throat and continuing to do whatever the missile may have continued to do. So what we find in this autopsy report, in the summary, no mention of cerebellum tissue, high shoulder wound coming out the throat, and of course an entrance wound to the back of the head. The description of the wounds given in the Bethesda autopsy report, in other words, now closely corresponds to the description of the two wounds we find in the death certificate that was prepared in Dallas for Therod Warren, but which he refused to sign. There were several curious features about the autopsy, apart from the discrepancies between the description of the wounds as they were observed at Bethesda and as they were observed at Parkland. For example, 3 pieces of bone were brought into the autopsy while it was being conducted. One was a rather large piece that looked a great deal like the piece I'm going to show you now, but was not this piece. The piece I'm showing you now was discovered by a medical student by the name of William Harper the day after the assassination, about 5:30 p.m., long after the autopsy had been completed. Harper took this fragment to his uncle, who was a physician at Southern Methodist University, and he and a colleague examined it and took photographs of it and determined that it appeared to be a piece of occipital bone missing from the back of a human head. Now, that corresponds closely with the funeral director's report that when he prepared the body for burial at Bethesda Hospital, there was a large gaping wound to the back of the head which had to be filled in with plaster Paris, but that it was not noticeable when the head reclined on a pillow because it couldn't be seen. That's very consistent, however, with the descriptions at Parkland of that large defect to the back of the head. Here's a diagram that Boswell prepared, one of 2 diagrams he prepared. The other was a close-up of the hole in the skull where he had a sketch of where these bone fragments might possibly have been fitted in. And what's important about this diagram for our purpose at the moment is the location of the back wound. Notice in relation to the circle with the X where that location is. It's far down from the neck on the right, okay? It's about 6 inches down from the collar on the right, and does not appear to be at a location where, if it were fired from above and behind, it could possibly have exited through the throat. Here's another description of the wound with photographs of the shirt that the president was wearing and his jacket. We find a description here of measurements that were performed by Robert Frazier of the FBI, who describes a hole through the president's jacket that was found to lie 5 3/8 inches below the top of the collar and 1 3/4 inches to the right of the midline. When you consider the location of the holes in the shirt and the jacket, it is very difficult to imagine that a bullet which entered at that location on the president's back could possibly have exited through his throat. Take a look now at the death certificate on the president that was executed by the president's personal physician, Admiral Berkeley. This is the 3rd death certificate on President Kennedy. And notice the description given here of the wound other than the head wound. He says, a second wound occurred in the posterior back at about the level of the 3rd thoracic vertebrae. Well, if you look on the lower left here, the diagram, a 3rd thoracic vertebrae, again, is at a location fairly far down and away from the neck. You can see it corresponds almost exactly to the location of the jacket and the shirt as to where the wound occurred, and also corresponds with Boswell's diagram. If you look on the right, you can see one way in which apologists for the official version of the autopsy have sought to account for this discrepancy by suggesting that perhaps the president's jacket was bunched up so that the location that is shown by the shirt and the jacket does not actually correspond to the location in the body. But that, of course, is contradicted by the president's personal physician's death certificate and by all the other evidence we've seen. Plus, when you study the Zapruder film, as we'll have a chance to do later, there's no indication that his jacket was bunched up like that. Now, if that isn't enough to satisfy you, here's an excerpt from an FBI report on December 9, 1963 that describes the wound the following way. Medical examination of the president's body revealed that one of the bullets had entered just below his shoulder to the right of the spinal column at an angle of 45 to 60 degrees downward, that there was no point of exit, and that the bullet was not in the body. All of that seems to be very consistent evidence that the location of the wound to the back was not where the autopsy pathologist subsequently claimed it was located, and does not provide support for the conjecture that the wound that entered the back passed through the body and exited through the throat. In fact, that's not the only evidence we have that the pathologists actually knew about the wound to the throat long before they claimed to know. The Parkland press conference, for example, was widely publicized on radio and television, reporting repeatedly a wound to the throat. Second of all, other witnesses have testified about many phone calls between Parkland and Bethesda. Most recently, the testimony to the Warren Commission of Lieutenant Commander Ebersol, who was the officer who was participating in the radiology and the x-rays of the president, who indicated several phone calls. Plus, Nurse Aubrey Bell at Parkland Hospital reported that the morning of the 23rd, when Malcolm Perry came in, that she had never seen anyone who looked so dejected, that they had kept him up all night trying to persuade him to change his description of the wound to the throat from that of an entrance wound to an exit wound. All this evidence seems very powerful indication that the physician, in fact, had knowledge of the wound to the throat long before they acknowledge having had that knowledge. If we want any more confirmation of this circumstance, however, we have it from Dr. Robert Livingston, who, as I have previously indicated, was the highest-ranking scientist in both the Eisenhower and Kennedy administrations, and who, after learning of a wound to the throat through radio and television broadcasts, made a phone call over to Bethesda Naval Hospital and actually spoke with Commander Humes. This is a tape that Dr. Livingston prepared at my request. Listen to what he has to say.
Now, what seems most relevant from my personal experience is that on that same evening, before the President's body on Air Force One had arrived at Andrews Air Force Base, I telephoned to Bethesda Naval Hospital. I believe the call was made before the plane arrived because I recollect that it was following that call that I watched Robert S. McNamara, Bob McNamara, a long-standing, since 1952, mountain climbing and hiking companion of mine, received the Kennedy entourage and the casket being lowered on a forklift from the rear of the Air Force One onto the field tarmac. Inasmuch as I was scientific director of two of the institutes at the NIH, both institutes pertinent to the matter of the President's assassination and brain injury, the Navy hospital operator and the officer on duty put me through to speak directly with Dr. Humes, Dr. Commander James Humes, who was waiting to perform the autopsy. After introductions, we began a pleasant conversation. He told me that he had not heard much about reporting from Dallas and from Parkland Hospital. I told him that the reason for making such an importuning call was to stress that the Parkland Hospital physician's examination of President Kennedy revealed what they reported to be a small wound in the neck, closely adjacent to and to the right of the trachea. I explained that I had knowledge from the literature on high-velocity wound ballistics research, in addition to considerable personal combat experience examining and repairing bullet and shrapnel wounds. I was confident that a small wound of that sort had to be a wound of entrance, and that if it were a wound of exit, it would almost certainly be widely blown out with cruciate or otherwise wide tearing outward ruptures of the underlying tissues and skin. It probably would also have ruptured the trachea or penetrated it. I stressed to Dr. Humes how important it was that the autopsy pathologists carefully examine the President's neck to characterize that particular wound and to distinguish it from the neighboring tracheostomy wound. I went on to presume further that the neck wound would probably not have anything to do with the main cause of death, massive disruptive brain injury, because of the angle of bullet trajectory and the generally upright position of the president's body sitting up in the limousine. Yet, I said carefully, if that wound were confirmed to be a wound of entry, it would prove beyond peradventure of doubt that that shot had been fired from in front. Hence, that if there were shots from behind, there had to have been more than one gunman. Just at that moment, there was an interruption in our conversation. Dr. Humes resumed after a pause of a few seconds to say, quote, "The FBI will not let me talk any further," end quote. I wished him good luck, and the conversation was ended. My wife can be good witness to that conversation because we shared our mutual distress over the terrible events, and she shared with me my considerations weighing the decision to call over to the Bethesda Naval Hospital. The call originated in the kitchen of our home in Burning Tree Road in Bethesda, with her being present throughout. After the telephone call, I exclaimed to her my dismay over the abrupt termination of my conversation with Dr. Humes. Though through the intervention of the FBI, I wondered aloud why they would want to interfere with a conversation between physicians relative to the problem of how best to investigate and interpret the autopsy. Now, with knowledge of the apparently prompt and massive control of information that was imposed on assignment of responsibility for the assassination of President Kennedy, I can appreciate that the interruption may have been far more pointed than I presumed at that time. I conclude, therefore, on the basis of personal experience, that Dr. Humes did have his attention drawn to the specifics and significance of President Kennedy's neck wound prior to his beginning the autopsy. His testimony that he only learned about the neck wound on the day after completion of the autopsy, after he had communicated with Dr. Perry in Dallas by telephone, means that he either forgot what I told him, although he appeared to be interested and attentive at the time, or that the autopsy was already under explicit non-medical control.
I spoke with Dr. Livingston's former wife as to whether she recollected this particular conversation. She told me she didn't recall that specific conversation, but she did recall a telephone call he had received from Bethesda asking him to describe the difference between a throat and an entrance wound to the throat and an exit wound to the throat. Now, given her description of a recollection, it may be that she simply selectively remembered part of the conversation that Dr. Livingston had with Commander Humes, because such a description was a part of that conversation. These are by no means the only indications of irregularity in the autopsy of JFK. When we go through the supplemental autopsy report, for example, we find a gross description of the brain characterizing the brain as following formalin fixation, weighing 1,500 grams. Well, I've discussed this matter with Dr. Livingston, who's a world authority on the human brain, and he assures me that the typical weight for an adult human brain is 1,300 to 1,400 grams. Plus, when you consider that a large amount of this brain was shot out, described as shot out in Dallas by the physicians there, it's very difficult to imagine how this brain could possibly have weighed anything near 1,500 grams. In addition, as we proceed down through these other paragraphs, we find the description of the brain suggests that the left cerebral hemisphere is intact and that the right cortex, there's damage to the right cortex, but yet there's no description here of any damage to the cerebellum. So that fundamental observation which was made at Dallas is not corroborated by this supplemental report. Again, at the top of the second page, we find black and white and color photographs have been exposed but not developed, and that they've been turned over by hand to Rear Admiral Berkeley, the White House physician. What's also interesting here is the description of the kidneys. Sections show no significant abnormalities aside from dilation and engorgement of blood vessels of all calibers. But what's intriguing is the omission of any description of the adrenal glands. This was of great interest to many physicians because Jack Kennedy was widely believed to be suffering from Addison's disease, which is a disease of adrenal gland insufficiency, which could have been confirmed here by the autopsy report, and yet it remains silent on this point. Finally, of course, we get the transmitting orders from Captain Stover, who who was a commanding officer of the medical school, and Admiral Galloway, who was the commanding officer of the Naval Medical Center. So this report was forwarded to the President's personal physician. Kathleen Cunningham, as I have indicated, has been very successful in obtaining documents and records, and one of the most important she provided to me was a copy of the autopsy report on J.D. Tippit. You may recall that Officer Tippit was also shot and killed in Dallas that day. And what we have here is a rather remarkable document that begins, you'll notice, with no clinical summary. There's no clinical summary or speculations about the shooters involved or where the shots were fired from or how many shots were fired. In the case of this autopsy report, there's no quoting of newspapers or other rumors. Rather, it begins directly with an external examination of a well-developed white male measuring 5 foot 11 inches in length and weighing 175 to 80 pounds and so forth. It's very professional, very straightforward, very exact. This autopsy report is quite complete. The brain is described as weighing 1,350 grams. The kidneys here are clearly described as weighing together 350 grams, but more importantly, it includes a description of the adrenal glands, which are said to be not remarkable. The summary on the next page, gunshot wound to the head. You turn the page and we find very exact measurements of the location of these wounds. It turns out that Officer Tippit was shot 3 times in the body and once in the head. Interestingly, turn the page, we see descriptions again on standard diagrams of the shots to the body. And you can begin to perceive the location of the shot to the head. When you turn the page, you discover that Officer Tippit was shot in the right temple at approximately the same location that Malcolm Kilduff described President Kennedy as having been shot, which may not be completely coincidental. Then we have additional information about the toxicological reports and so forth on Officer Tippit. What's so striking here, I think, is that the study of that autopsy report is so very different and far more professional than that which was done on President Kennedy. Perhaps most important to observe is that the pathologist who conducted this was Earl F. Rose, who's a very famous, world-famous forensic pathologist. And if the body had remained in Dallas, then Earl Rose would have completed the autopsy on John Fitzgerald Kennedy. As we all know, President Johnson did not waste time in forming a commission to investigate the assassination of President Kennedy. The assassination occurred on the 22nd of November, and he appointed the commission on November 29th, exactly a week later. The composition of the commission is rather unusual, consisting of 5 Republicans and 2 Democrats, both Southerners, Richard Russell and Hale Boggs. The most sympathetic member of the commission in relation to the policies of President Kennedy, no doubt, was Chief Justice Earl Warren, and yet that was a very unusual appointment to make, realizing that the Chief Justice is the head of the American judicial system. Suppose that the investigations of the commission had led to the discovery of evidence suitable for bringing charges in a court of law. No doubt in a case of this kind, it would have been of such magnitude that it would eventually have made its way before the Supreme Court. And yet now the Chief Justice had been compromised by his participation in the investigation and therefore could not be a member of the court in reviewing such evidence. It's also interesting to observe that Allen Dulles was appointed to the commission. Allen Dulles had been fired from the Central Intelligence Agency, removed as its director by John Kennedy in the aftermath of the Bay of Pigs, the attempted invasion of Cuba. And it's very odd that he should have been appointed by LBJ to participate. I think you begin to understand the nature of the Warren Commission report when you realize that the report itself, summarizing the findings, was published on September 27, 1964, and the 26 volumes of supporting evidence, testimony, and exhibits was published on November 23, 1964, because an interesting event occurred in the meanwhile, namely the election, the presidential election of 1964. As a number of students of the assassination have observed, the evidence in the 26 volumes also appeared to contradict the summary findings that were presented as conclusions of the report, perhaps the most important early work on this subject being that by Sylvia Marr, Accessories After the Fact, which was published already in 1967. It's also interesting to observe that the Warren Commission was never successful in establishing that Lee Harvey Oswald had either the motive or the means or the opportunity to assassinate the president. With respect to motive, his wife Marina reported that Lee Harvey Oswald admired Jack and Jackie and thought that they were fine people and had no particular animosity toward them. As far as means is concerned, the rifle that was alleged to have been used was a cheap World War II Italian rifle, a bolt-action rifle that seemed to be a very poor choice for use in an assassination of this kind. And third, within 90 seconds of the assassination, Lee Harvey Oswald had been observed on the second floor of the Texas School Book Depository building drinking a Coke in a lunchroom by Officer Marion Baker, a motorcycle patrolman who rushed into the Dallas Book Depository building, and Roy Truly, who was Oswald's supervisor. It's very unlikely that Oswald could possibly have been on the second floor drinking a Coke where he was observed if he'd also been on the sixth floor shooting at the president. Now, the evidence that was presented by the Warren Commission was very interesting. Apparently, Earl Warren was shown copies of the photographs and was so horrified by them that he refused to allow them to be shared by the other members of the commission, who instead relied upon drawings. Here's an example of one of the drawings that was used by the commission. As you can see, it's consistent with the Bethesda autopsy report of a bullet entering in the back of the head in the vicinity of the occipital protuberance and passing through the entire head and blasting out a huge amount of the skull, such as resembles in a general way the configuration described by the footprint. Here's a second set of diagrams now that relates that description of the head wound to its presumptive entry in the back of the head. And notice too now the location of the wound to the back. Notice how high up it is and how it's located really in the lower part of the neck rather than in the vicinity of the third thoracic vertebrae where Admiral Berkeley positioned it and where the shirt and the jacket located and where Boswell's diagram indicated it was placed. And notice too now on this next diagram how that transit is supposed to have taken place from the back of the neck through the president's musculature, not hitting any bony tissue, and emerging through the throat. This is the way in which the so-called magic bullet or single bullet, which is alleged to have done all the damage to Jack, this, 2 wounds in Jack and 5 wounds in Connolly, is supposed to have taken place according to the Warren report. Now you might think that there'd be a difficulty here in coping with all of the eyewitness testimony to the contrary, especially, for example, that of Malcolm Perry, whom you'll recall asserted on 3 different occasions during the Parkland press conference that the wound to the throat had been an entrance wound. However, we find how the junior counsel to the commission, Arlen Specter, coped with that problem by postulating a hypothetical question that he fashioned here. Notice on this display that he invites the attention of Malcolm Perry to the reference to the presence of a wound on the upper right posterior thorax, and of course again it's indicated by the circle with an X. So he's inviting his attention to the back wound, to a description of the back wound. And then he goes ahead and introduces certain assumptions. First he says, assuming that was a point of entry of a missile, assuming still further that the missile which struck the president at that spot was a 6.5 millimeter jacketed bullet shot from a rifle at a distance of 160 to 250 feet, having a muzzle velocity of approximately 2,000 feet per second. And incidentally, of course, this set of assumptions relates the question, the description of the wound, to the position, the alleged sniper's nest in the Texas School Book Depository building, which was less than 100 yards from where this wound is presumed to have been inflicted. And the muzzle velocity of 2,000 feet per second is the muzzle velocity of a Mannlicher Carcano, the kind of rifle that Oswald is alleged to have used. Then he says, if that had entered in the back, and if it had been fired by such a weapon, and if it had been passing at such a rate, and then it had exited from the president's throat in the wound which you have described in the midline of his neck, then Specter asked, would your findings and observations as to the nature of the wound on the throat be consistent with the set of facts I just presented? What essentially Specter has done is said, now if you assume that the wound to the back was a wound of entry, and if you assume that it passes through the muscles, it doesn't hit any bones, exited through the throat, then would it be correct to say that the wound to the throat was a wound of exit? And of course, Malcolm Perry concedes that the wound could have been inflicted that way, but that he was not in the position to attest or vouch for the veracity of the factors that he had been asked to assume. The problem is that anything can be proven by assumption. Suppose, for example, that Arlen Specter wanted to convey the impression that you believe the United States Senate is populated by aliens from outer space. Then he might question you as follows. Assume that George Mitchell is an alien from outer space. Assume that Dianne Feinstein is an alien from outer space, and so forth until assume that Bob Dole is an alien from outer space, and assume that Arlen Specter is an alien from outer space. Then he'd ask you to make one more assumption, namely that those are all the members of the United States Senate. He could then ask, would the conclusion that every member of the United States Senate is an alien from outer space be consistent with those assumptions? And of course you'd respond that it was, but that you were not in the position to vouch for or verify the factors you had been asked to assume. That is Arlen Specter pulling verbal rabbits out of verbal hats. In addition, it's interesting that the assumptions that were made here about the rifle do describe the Mannlicher Arcano, but that the wounds themselves are characterized as having been inflicted by a high-velocity weapon. The reason this is interesting is that high-velocity weapons have muzzle velocities of 2,500 feet per second or higher, which means that the Mannlicher Arcano, alleged to have been used by Oswald to commit the assassination, was not a high-velocity weapon. So if the wounds were in fact inflicted by high-velocity missiles, as the official autopsy report in the Warren Commission would conclude, then Oswald has in fact been vindicated as the assassin. Several students of the assassination have made this observation, including Peter Model and Robert Groden in their book JFK, The Case for Conspiracy, which was published in 1976. It's also interesting that the Parkland transcript, in which Malcolm Perry repeatedly asserted that the wound to the throat was a wound of entry, was not made available to the Warren Commission. In those transcripts where they discuss the problem, it's pointed out that the press that has been covering the assassination, in this instance, I believe CBS, had over 200 hours of videotape which had yet to be transcribed and cataloged. And therefore, the explanation was given that it couldn't be made available because they had to process 200 hours of tape. But notice, if you stop and think about it, that Parkland transcript would have had to be among the very first, perhaps the first half an hour of that 200 hours of tape. So that's hardly a reasonable explanation for why the Parkland transcript of the Parkland press conference was not made available to the Warren Commission. In his remarkable book, Who Killed Kennedy, which was published already in 1964, Thomas Buchanan has observed what may be the most remarkable aspect of the Commission's inquiry, namely, that no matter how the evidence may have changed, the government's conclusions remained the same. In many of those cases in which the evidence did not conform to those conclusions, it appears to have been either distorted or ignored. The Commission's own reconstruction of the magic bullet theory is a case in point. As photographs appearing in the Warren Report and a recent story in U.S. News disclosed, the staff not only did not use the Lincoln limousine in which the president was riding or another vehicle of the same kind, but actually employed the Secret Service Cadillac, a vehicle of a completely different make with a different configuration of passenger compartment and seats, to reconstruct the crime of the century. This may seem preposterous, but that is what was done, as these photographs display. A more blatant case of the fabrication of evidence would be difficult to conceive. What then are we left as our legacy from the Warren Commission study? Well, it's well portrayed here in this diagram of the magic bullet theory, where a bullet from an assassin's gun about 60 feet high from the 6th floor of the school book depository building enters the back about 5 3/4 inches below the collar, made a sharp left-hand move through his body in order to exit at his throat approximately the level of his tie, went on to enter the back of Governor Connolly, pass through his body, shatter a rib, exit and impact with his right wrist, and then wind up being deflected in his thigh, where the bullet nevertheless suffered no deformity. You'll notice here a photograph of this practically pristine bullet known as the magic bullet. Surely any bullet that could have inflicted all of those wounds and suffer so little damage would indeed have been magical.